You know, people often praise natural foods and organic produce as healthier than what we typically eat nowadays. But have you ever stopped to wonder how dangerous some of these vegetables once were before cultivation gave us the modern ones we see and eat today? Well, Brazil is known for lots of cultural things such as the statue of Jesus, soccer, and other fun things. Introducing the cassava. This veggie, even today, still packs one of the most dangerous toxins you could possibly ingest on the planet. A single bite of cassava can shut down your lungs, cause diarrhea, send you to a coma, shock your heart, and paralyze you for the rest of your entire life. Now, what could possibly deal such damage? Cyanide? Well, not actually cyanide, but chemicals that can make cyanide. Cyanogenic glycosides. These buds are well hidden inside the plant and will activate when one damages the cassava. Or in other words, don't eat me or I will kill you. I swear some of these ancient botanists were like, hey, so you know that very same plant that not only ended Yarzi but also stole his wife, house, and kids? Yeah? Let's find a way to farm and eat it. Next up, potatoes. Being a part of the nightshade family, potatoes are known for having both Solanine and an awesome family name. Nightshade. Sounds like it's straight out of an emo boy band. 'Cause tonight will be the night that I will fry for you over a guy. You know, that kind of stuff. Now you see stuff like this in Minecraft where you'd see like bits of green in the potatoes. That green bit is not the poison. More accurately, it's more of a coin toss from here on there. People often misunderstood that the green bits is the poison, but that's not the case. That's just chlorophyll for being exposed on sunlight for too long. Well, I eat potatoes all the time. What's the worst thing that can happen if I eat the green part? Diarrhea, headache, hallucination, death, you know, the usual. Yeah, see what I'm saying here? Though to be fair, they do taste good. Next up, tomatoes. Also a nightshade bandmate. So you know he's rocking that Solanine. But what's different about tomatoes is he can fly solo. No need for Solanine when you have tomatine. Although tomatine is not as potent as Solanine, but they do exist in the same plant. Given enough dosage, some bite is a nightmare. Oh, sorry. Specifically green tomatoes and tomatoes that hasn't ripened enough will contain tomatine. They're usually harmless, but in rare cases, it will cause muscle cramps, signs of paralysis, liver and heart failure, and the usual diarrhea. So make sure to eat them with precaution. Coffea beans. Don't talk to me yet. I will literally kill if I haven't had my morning coffee. Well, turns out coffee happens to have the same idea. Only this time they're always out for blood. Originating from Ethiopia, these little guys can mess with your heart rate and make you feel fatigue at the same time. And in rare cases, cardiac arrest. Now, because we bred them into their most docile form, their potency has ever since weakened, until it's only very few amount of mammals and humans can happily consume it. Well, unless you do this very dangerous potion this guy's making. Alright, that's all of the common food I can think of right now. My brain ran dry from that yellowish red cassava stew with green potatoes that I ate while drinking my heavily concentrated coffee. See you next time.